Picture this. Two young fish swimming along one fine morning, and they swim past an older fish going the other direction, who says, "Hey boys, how's the water?" And the two younger fish, they keep swimming along for a little bit, and then one turns to the other and says, "What's water?" Now this story is a fable. It tells us something that is true but hard to see, or is hidden from plain sight. And in this 7-session series on community, we will be diving into the different aspects of the water that you and I are swimming in the Western world at the beginning of 2023. And in this series, we'll be diving into how this water that we are swimming in pulls us away from Jesus' vision of our lives in community. And for this first session, we will be exploring one of the biggest pulls away from the relational life of community that Jesus puts on offer, and that's individualism. The current, the water that you and I swim in each and every day is that of individualism. This is the culture that we call home. From the shopping mall to the latest social media trend to our conversations and ideas, most of our lives centers around ourselves. And now a generation back already, C.S. Lewis noticed this trend, this movement towards individualism, the focus on the self. And he said that in the West, the Trinity has been slowly replaced and pushed out by a new pseudo-Trinity that is centered around our holy wants, holy needs, and holy desires. These are our gods, the drivers of our life. The seductive nature of individualism has snuck even into our churches. And with the talk and the movement over the last little bit towards spiritual formation and disciplines, which is an amazing thing and so needed, but I think a danger for our moment right now is that the enemy may want to deceive and use the good movement of spiritual formation and co-opt it and use it for his purposes, to try and corrupt a good thing towards bad ends. Those bad ends being turning in even more than we're already doing towards ourselves, where we become hyper-focused on caring about me, where the language becomes even more therapeutic and Christianity becomes focused on self-care with Jesus added on top, where Jesus becomes a self-help coach. Like even when talking about community. There was this poll that was done in churches across North America asking why people joined a community group. And one of the main reasons that people joined and participated within the group was to feel better about themselves, which ranked first when asked the reason why a person felt that they belonged in a group. And some other reasons included so that I could be poured into and so that I could feel closer to God. I just want us to notice that those things aren't bad in and of themselves, but all of those reasons are focused in on themselves, on self. We are obsessed with ourselves. Right in our culture of individualism, in the water we swim in, Jesus' challenge in the Gospel of Matthew is this: you're not in the driver's seat of your life. I am. Don't run from suffering, embrace it. Follow me and I'll show you how. Self-help is no help at all. Self-sacrifice is the way, my way to find yourself, your true self. Dietrich Bonhoeffer says, when Christ bids a man, when he invites someone to follow after him, he invites them to come and die. And this is such a flip script of what we hear on a day-to-day basis. It's not be true to ourselves, or it's not live my best life now. No, I just imagine Jesus with so much compassion in his voice. You want to know the pathway to life? Well, you do it by losing your life. You need to learn that life doesn't revolve around you, because on the other side of that is life that's truly life. Now, before we explore how community is the response to the way of Jesus of our culture of individualism, we're going to break off to have some discussion. So we'll see you in a bit. In a culture of individualism, the response of the way of Jesus is that of community. But what is community as a follower of Jesus? Now, if I was to pack it into one run-on sentence, it would say something like this: community is a diverse and inclusive group of persons unified around following the way of Jesus, who are radically set apart through deep vulnerability and sharing, embodying a culture of honoring one another and forgiving those around them, with the soul and desire being communion or love of Jesus and love of neighbor. Or to put it a little bit more simply, Community is a group of followers of Jesus trying to be with Jesus, become like Jesus, and do what Jesus did together in a city. The call or invitation of Jesus is to become a disciple, an apprentice, to learn and adopt and imitate Jesus' example for what it means to be a human on this earth. And it has been said before that solitude is the furnace of transformation. That is where our lives are purified, where things that are messy and impure within us come up to the surface. And I would say that on the flip side of that is community, and it's the hammer of our transformation. Like keeping with that same metaphor of a blacksmith, in community, our character is shaped and hammered and molded like a blacksmith using a hammer, until eventually what comes out, the end result, is the character that we end up with. Now that can be a good thing or a bad thing depending on who we spend our time with. You and I, we are designed for and defined by our relationships. Like, look at the people that you spend your life with. You are in one way or another the sum accumulation of the people that you spend time with. And I think this is why following Jesus is never an invitation for just you to just live your life on your own, where it's just you and a podcast and like you'll just figure it out. But I think that's why Jesus gave us the church. And the church is one of those moments where he puts his finger on it again, like he puts his finger on a truth that's just grounded in reality. That this thing called life, the thing that you and I do each and every day, it's all about relationships. But the idea of community didn't start with Jesus. And if we look back at the beginning pages of our Bible, God says that it's not good for humanity to be alone. God looks at an individual and says that his vision of things begins as there should be humanity in community with other people. And if that wasn't enough, like that's actually not the first time that that idea of community shows up. Because if we look at God, the Godhead, the Trinity, Father, Son, and Spirit together, before there was even creation, there was already community. Father, Son, Spirit, in a union of love. And that then when God says, let us make humanity in our own image, and then comments that it's not good for humanity to be alone, I think that a grounding point that the scripture writers are trying to make for us is this, that for humanity to properly image God, we do so in community. When we look at the life of Jesus himself, he himself was in deep community with 12 disciples around him that he did life with, shared meals with, grew with. Following Jesus is an invitation to life with others. Discipleship happens in community, and community is discipleship in action. Now, to highlight some misconceptions, because I feel like there's a lot out there about community, these are some ideas that I've noticed that even I myself slip into from time to time. And see, misconception one is this. You might think that community is just a group of your friends, and that while people who are in community can become friends, friendship is not the basis for community. Jesus is. When we look at what Jesus invites us to call one another in the church, he invites us to call each other brother and sister. And when you think about family, you don't choose the people that you're family with. And I think there's a similar relationship to that in the church. Misconception two, that community is easy and should feel good, when in reality, community is crazy difficult and will probably cause a lot of pain. And you're like, okay, Matt, like I'm out, like I'm leaving this practice. But first, it's not just your homies that I'm supposed to hang out with and it's difficult. And I think the response again would be the voice of Jesus, reminding us that his way is the way to life. And that we are actually, you and I, that we're actually craving. And that on the other side of difficulty and pain is a group of people who are grounded in forgiveness and grace and love, where people are known and seen and heard. Now that sounds pretty good. And misconception three, well, this one's more of a warning than a misconception. That the person who loves his dream of community more than the community itself becomes the destroyer of that community. Individual idealism and personal dream of what community could be is not our friend when it comes to community. Going into community with the dream that community will solve our problems and that these people will cure my loneliness or whatever the dream might be, those expectations of community will lead to a lot of disappointment and hurt. But I think that's the hidden gem, that on the other side of giving up that dream, real connection and life can be found. And in response to those misconceptions, here are some goals of community. 1, to bring the message of salvation and healing to one another. 2, to be an embodiment of grace and inclusion to each other in Jesus. 3, to be bound, to be attached to one another in faith in Jesus. 4, to be the space where we work out our transformation into the image of Christ. See, this is community. The messy, amazing, more full of pain and joy and life that is truly life, that vision that Jesus gives us and invites us into. Dallas Willard once said, "Community is essential because love is essential. Everything is directed towards love." See, we all need community. Now I'm going to toss it back to you to wrestle through what it means to embody and take on Jesus' vision for life with others. Okay, so here's the plan. For the last part of every session, we're going to be brainstorming ideas and ways that we can take the information that we have just learned and try and put that information into practice, to try and habituate it, get it into our bodies. And a brief why we do this, for those of you that's like, okay, that kind of sounds like legalism, or maybe you haven't been taught a discipleship approach to following Jesus. Now, this is one of the secrets of following Jesus, and as Dallas Willard calls it, and it is living as Jesus lived in the entirety of his life, adopting his overall lifestyle. Following in his steps cannot be equated with behaving as he did when he was on the spot. To live as Christ lived is to live as he did in all of his life. Now, our mistake is to think that following Jesus consists in loving our enemies, going the second mile, turning the other cheek, and suffering patiently and hopefully while living the rest of our lives just as everyone around us does. So to that end, to take on the character and the likeness of Christ, we put into practice the habits and the rhythms that he had in his life that opened him up to the Spirit working in him to form him. So what are some of the practices that we could plan into our days and weeks that could help us index us more and more into the life of community? And we have 3. First is this: write down a list of all the expectations that you have for community. Have a moment of naming them out loud in a group and make sure that it's a judgment-free zone when you're naming them. Give them over to God and ask for the Spirit that he would give you his heart for a God and neighbor-focused vision of community. And the second is this: as we talked about before, we can be very me or I focused. Now this week, practice praying using us and we language instead, because it might shape our brain into thinking a little bit differently. And finally, take a spiritual gifts test. Now the gifts of the spirits are and were supposed to be worked out and used within community for the building up of that community. Instead of asking the question of what is the community giving me, what if we instead flip that question around and said, okay, what ways has God uniquely gifted me to be able to give back, to sow into, to build up my community? Now I'll toss it back to you for some final thoughts and discussion, but this wraps our first session on community. Tune in for the next session as we dive into the importance of unity in a culture of division. Peace.